April 7th, 1945. Tokyo Bay, Empire of Japan. Dawn spreads over the home islands as 91 North American P-51D Mustangs from the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups close on their rendezvous point. In his cockpit, Major James B. Tapp tightens his grip on the stick. 6 wing-mounted 50 caliber M2 Brownings sit ready, belted with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Early P-51D blocks carried 500 rounds for each inboard gun and 270 for the center and outboard guns, a total of 2,380 rounds. Later blocks cut the inboard load to 400 rounds to improve reliability, bringing the total to 1,180. Below, Mount Fuji rises clean and bright against the morning sky, its snow crown a perfect navigation mark the pilots will use all day. The low sun throws long shadows over rice paddies, villages, and scattered military sites, places that have never seen American fighters. The mission is a first. Escort B-29 superfortresses deep over Japan from a base 750 miles away, a range planner said 2 years earlier no single-engine fighter could cover. At Iwo 700, more than 100 Japanese interceptors close on the American stream. Through the haze, the Japanese see what they were told could not happen: single-engine American fighters over Tokyo. This is not the short-legged Navy from carriers. These are land-based Army fighters that have crossed 750 miles of open water to reach the imperial capital. Leading the defense are pilots in Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, Frank, Japan's fastest late-war fighter, backed by older Ki-43 Hayabusa, Ki-44 Shoki, Ki-61 Hien, and Navy A6M0 and N1K2J Shiden Kai. At some altitudes and speeds, the Ki-84 can outclimb and outturn the P-51 and the Republic P-47. What follows will show the huge technology gap between the two sides, and why American industry produced what many pilots called the perfect long-range fighter. The P-51D arrived in the Pacific with a reputation forged over Europe, where it broke the Luftwaffe and made daylight bombing possible. Built first for Britain, the type transformed when the British fitted the Rolls-Royce Merlin. That change, Allison-powered early models to Merlin-powered thoroughbred, was one of aviation's great international collaborations, marrying American aerodynamics with British engine genius. The result, the P-51D, gave the USAF a high-performance, high-altitude, long-range escort that could shepherd heavy bombers to Berlin and back, and now, astonishingly, from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and home. The Packard-built V-1657, a licensed Merlin 66, made 1,095 horsepower at takeoff with water injection and up to 1,720 in emergency war power. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger held power where Japanese engines faded thin. The P-51D topped out around 440 MHP at 25,000 feet, reached almost 42,000 feet, and carried 6 50-caliber Brownings. The math of firepower was ruthless. 6 guns at about 800 rounds per minute each, 4,800 per minute, 80 per second. Each API round weighed about 46 grams and left the muzzle near 2,900 feet per second, with enough punch to pierce armor, light fuel, and wreck engines with brief, aimed bursts. By late 1944, 14 of 15 U.S. 8th Air Force fighter groups flew Mustangs, a direct vote for its superiority. All this rested on production. Assembly lines ran day and night. North American plants at Inglewood and Dallas turned out Mustangs at a rate that boggled the mind. At peak, roughly 1 per hour. By war's end, 15,586 P-51s of all variants were built. The D model alone accounted for 8,156, more than Japan produced of all fighter types in the final 2 years combined. The very long-range reach that delivered Mustangs to Tokyo changed air warfare's math. With dual 110-gallon drop tanks, they flew 1,500-mile round trips as routine, stretching to 1,600 when needed. Like flying Los Angeles to Little Rock, over water, in a single-engine plane with the ocean as the only alternate. The key was the Merlin's efficiency at cruise, about 65 gallons per hour at economy settings, paired with the Mustang's laminar-flow wing that cut drag by roughly a third versus conventional airfoils. North American aerodynamicist Edgar Schmood's wing kept smooth airflow farther back, delaying turbulence and slashing parasitic drag. Across from this stood the Nakajima Ki-84, which entered service in June 1944, too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome. Nicknamed Gale and codenamed Frank, it was Japan's bid to match U.S. tech with what resources remained. The Ki-84 was arguably Japan's best late war fighter in any quantity, though quantity was relative. What Japan called mass production, America would call a prototype run. It was fast and agile, often armed with two 30mm Ho 155 cannon and two 20mm Ho 5 cannon. On paper, that was crushing firepower, but the 30s carried only 50 rounds per gun and the 20s about 150 per gun, roughly 400 rounds total, versus a Mustang's 180 to 380. On spec sheets, the Ki-84 could look competitive, even better in some niches. Power came from the Nakajima Ha-45 Homare, an 18-cylinder radial with fuel injection and a single-stage, two-speed supercharger using water methanol to hit a rated 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. Early tests impressed. About 308 at 7 mph level, with best-case claims of 427 mph, given perfect fuel and tuning. But late-war Japanese production told another story. Quality sliding, improvisation rising, and systems failing. Crews learned the hard way to baby the Homar and its marginal landing gear, which too often folded at the worst time. The Homar needed tight tolerances. Japanese factories, bombed by B-29s and short of quality steel and aluminum, could no longer achieve. Heat treating for landing gear suffered. Impurities made proper hardening difficult. Result: too many Ki-84s lost to collapsed struts, aircraft Japan couldn't spare, and pilots couldn't replace. The production gap mirrored the wider crisis of a nation that had bet on a short war and lost. U.S. factories held standards as volumes soared, even improving methods. Japanese output fell apart. As quality control crumbled, pilots could not predict how a given plane would behave. Would the brakes hold? Would the engine survive high power? Could they even reach 30,000 feet to meet B-29s? By 1945, Japan had built about 3,514 Ki-84s, many grounded for want of parts, fuel, or pilots. Of those still flying, maybe half were truly combat-ready at a time. Fuel alone told the truth. America fed its fighters 100-octane gasoline refined in Texas and California, tailored for high-output engines. Japan burned whatever it could make or synthesize. Late-war Japanese fuel often tested at 87 octane or less, sometimes near 80, robbing power and causing pre-ignition that mangled pistons and valves. Some units tried pine root oil extracted from stumps, alcohol from sweet potatoes, even byproducts from sake. Each step another hit to engine health. Pilots reported engines that barely started, ran roughly, and failed in flight. On that first April 7th mission, Mustangs joined 103 B-29s of the 73rd Bomb Wing, each loaded with incendiaries for industrial targets. Captain Art Bridge of the 45th Squadron remembered the scene. A grand assembly circle of gleaming aluminum, like a school of giant silver fish. The rendezvous itself was a win for planning and navigation made possible by American tools. The P-51s had flown 750 miles of ocean on dead reckoning, aided by radio compass. Arriving within minutes of schedule, they climbed from sea level to 25,000 feet, mixtures adjusting automatically, superchargers shifting to high blower without drama. Crossing Honshu, the P-51s jettisoned their 110-gallon tanks and sighted the first head-on passes from more than 100 Japanese fighters scrambling around Tokyo. Silver drop tanks fell and flashed in the sun, some bursting on impact, others bouncing across patties. Japanese pilots, Ki-84, Ki-43, Ki-44, Ki-61, plus Zeros and Shiden Kai, felt the first jolt. Not carrier fighters, but land-based escorts that had reached the homeland from impossible distance. Flight Sergeant Totana Mizu of the 56th Sentai later wrote that at scramble they assumed enemy fighters was a mistake. Surely it meant bombers. Seeing the Mustangs with his own eyes felt like a dream. Commanders had sworn no American fighter could reach Japan from island bases. Yet there they were, owning the sky. In that moment, he knew the war was lost. Major James B. Tapp, later an ace with 8 victories, was among the first to slash into a Japanese gaggle. His report was clinical. They came in classic 3-ship Shotai. But execution was poor. Leaders committed, wingmen hesitated, maybe fuel, ammo, or inexperience. The Mustangs dove through with a 100 mph speed edge, snapped short bursts, then zoom climbed back to altitude before counterattacks could form. The breakdown reflected a training collapse already catastrophic. By 1945, most veteran Japanese pilots were gone, lost over the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, or in the Marianas. Turkey shoot. Replacements had as little as 50 hours total before combat. Americans averaged 600 before deployment. When the Mustangs landed back at Iwo Jima, the 7th Fighter Command Sunsetters claimed 26 victories, 1 probable, 5 damaged, for 2 P-51s and 1 pilot lost. A 13-to-1 ratio on day 1 would grow as Americans learned the air over Japan and Japanese pilot quality slid further. Within weeks, 20-to-1 and even 30-to-1 appeared, driven by U.S. advantages and Japanese desperation. Performance gaps were most brutal in the vertical, where modern fights were won. Above 20,000 feet, the usual intercept height, the Merlin's 2-stage blower held sea-level-like power, while Japanese engines suffocated. Stage 1 compressed the thin air, cooled it, then fed Stage 2 for more compression, delivering oxygen-rich charge to the cylinders. The Ki-84's single-stage unit, without intercooling or a second stage, bled power above 20,000, giving up speed and climb where it mattered. At 30,000 feet, the Ki-84 struggled near 350 milliamp. The P-51D could still run close to 420. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen of the 78th Squadron, who flew the last combat mission of the war on August 14, 1945, August 15 in Japan, described the typical meet. Japanese formations clawed upward, exhausts dark as throttles hit the stop. By 25,000 turn, they were wallowing. Engines smoked, running rich with superchargers unable to feed enough air. The Mustangs dove through with 650s blazing, tracers like beams, then zoomed away. The Merlin sang in the pull-up, G-forces crushing, while radial engines coughed. The P-51 held control near 500 milliamps in a dive, its laminar wing still effective deep into the transonic region. Japanese fighters often face control reversal or structural failure past 400 in a dive. Surfaces blanked, wings let go. Pilot skill magnified the gap. Americans reached Iwo with 400-600 hours, over 100 in type, heavy gunnery practice, and realistic training against seasoned instructors, captured enemy types, or accurate sims. Formation flying was second nature, instrument work in any weather standard. They trained deflection shooting on towed sleeves and camera guns for thousands of rounds. Japanese trainees in 1945 often had under 100 hours, sometimes 30, with little gunnery because ammunition was short, no instrument training, and tactics learned from manuals because the instructors were dead or at the front. Navigation alone divided survivors from losses. Flying single-engine fighters on one-off 100-mile overwater loops with few aids demanded experience and faith in both machine and system. Americans launched with weather briefs built from submarine reports and recon, accurate maps updated by photo, and instruments built to spec. Submarines on lifeguard duty sat along the route. PBY Dumbo boats were ready to pull crews from the sea. Japanese pilots often flew with old charts that ignored bomb damage, compasses out of swing, and no hope of rescue if they ditched. Rafts leaked. Rations were already eaten on the ground. Magnetic variation between Iwo and Tokyo in 1945 was about 3 degrees west. Tokyo lay near 139, 140 degree. Iwo near 141, 142 degree. That made the homeward leg simple compass work. A lucky geography that saved lives when weather closed in or combat disoriented pilots. Fly south-southeast long enough, and Mount Suribachi eventually rose from the sea, if fuel held. Logistics explained the Pacific Air War in plain terms. American abundance versus Japanese scarcity. Each Iwo mission sent nearly 100 Mustangs burning about 57,000 gallons of avgas and firing roughly 230,000 rounds of P-51 plus bombs and rockets for strafing. One day's output from one base, with 3 groups operating there. Behind that stood a supply web from Detroit factories, Texas refineries, and Missouri ammunition plants, tied by Liberty ships launched at 3 per day and C-54 transports flying regular Pacific routes. Ships reached Iwo daily with fuel, ammo, spares, food, mail. Everything a modern Air Force needs. Japanese logistics had fallen into chaos. Fuel shortages killed training. New pilots met combat cold. Ammunition was rationed, even in battle. Navy and Army air arms, never well coordinated, now fought each other for scraps. Aircraft were stripped for parts until only shells remained. Whole units sat grounded for lack of tires, spark plugs, or hydraulic fluid. Some tried to machine their own parts in crude shops with predictable results. The tech gap extended beyond airframes to every support detail. U.S. pilots wore G-suits that kept blood in the head, used reliable oxygen systems above 30,000 feet, and talked on clear multi-channel VHF. Parachutes were repacked on schedule. Life rafts had working radios and fresh supplies. Survival kits held morphine to fishing line. Japanese pilots often flew with radios that barely worked, oxygen gear that failed above 20,000, and no G-suits, meaning blackout or burst eye capillaries in hard turns. June 1st, 1945, Black Friday, to Mustang crews, proved that weather, not the enemy, could be the deadliest threat. About 150 Mustangs heading to Osaka hit a blinding front the forecast had missed. 27 were lost within minutes, 24 to weather alone. Pilots became disoriented in towering cloud, collided, or ran dry searching for clear air. The front ran from sea level to 40,000 with violent turbulence, icing, and zero visibility. St. Elmo's fire danced on wings, compass cards spun, and gyro horizons tumbled. Even for the side with better tools, VLR missions pushed men and machines to the edge. The morale impact on Japan was final. Captain Yoshio Yoshida of the 47th Sentai wrote that the sight of Mustangs over Tokyo shattered faith in command. They had been told B-29s were vulnerable without escorts, and that no escort could reach the homeland? Now Mustangs strafed airfields in daylight, downed their best pilots, and flew over the palace. The invasion stripes said it all, confident and numerous. The truth unspoken by leaders was obvious. The war was lost, and they were waiting to die. VLR missions were a pure flying test, Major Tapp said later. Dogfighting spiked adrenaline, but going point to point over endless ocean was the hard part. The sea was featureless and hypnotic. You questioned the compass, wondered if you were turned around. The strain built day after day. Pilots sat strapped in 8 hours or more. No standing, no stretch. Relief through a tube that sometimes froze at altitude. Legs cramped like knives. Numbness set in. Worry gnawed at every sound from the single engine over empty water. The Mustang cockpit, refined by 3 years of combat feedback, outclassed Japanese layouts across the board. The P-51D's bubble canopy gave true 360-degree view. A head turn could save your life. The seat and pedals adjusted to fit pilots. Controls were placed to cut fatigue on long legs. The panel put airspeed, altitude, and engine gauges in the natural sight line. The Ki-84 improved on earlier Japanese types, but still had poor rearward view due to structure and a tank behind the head, awkward controls that pulled hands from the stick, and hard-to-read instruments under G or vibration. Guns often decided who lived and who didn't in a blink. The P-51D's 650s looked modest next to mixed cannon, but they had decisive advantages. U.S. guns were extremely reliable, stoppages under 1% with proper care, which armorers ensured. Ammunition loads were far larger, roughly 1,880 to 1,380 rounds versus the Ki-84's 400 total. That let U.S. pilots take ranging shots, engage multiple targets, and keep shooting after brief bursts. Ballistics were well known. Americans could make hits at 400 yards. Japanese mixed armament complicated convergence and trajectory. Cannon rounds and machine gun rounds fell differently, making accurate long-range fire difficult. Gunnery training widened the gap. Americans fired thousands of rounds in practice, learned to lead, to judge range, and to burst short to avoid overheating. They drilled on sleeves, camera guns, and mock combat until deflection was instinct. Many Japanese trainees in 1945 were lucky to fire 100 rounds, if that. Ammunition was too scarce. Some entered their first fight never having shot in the air, trying to learn with an enemy on their tail. The Sunsetter's last air-to-air fight came near Tokyo on August 10, 1945, when the 15th and 506th Fighter Groups claimed 7 victories among the final dogfights of the war. By then, Japanese resistance was mostly symbolic, a faint echo of the force that once swept the Pacific. Fuel shortages kept most fighters grounded, their tanks drained to feed kamikaze units. Those that still flew were often in the hands of teenagers with scant training, boys who had been in school only months before. In all, Iwo's Mustangs were credited with 206 Japanese aircraft destroyed between April and August 1945, roughly 3/4 of Pacific P-51 aerial victories. The true total was likely higher. Many kills over Japan went unconfirmed, wreckage lost in forests or city ruins. The impact ran far beyond kill tallies. With P-51s over Japan, B-29s could bomb in daylight with accuracy, dismantling industry target by target. Production, already crippled by shortages and nighttime raids, collapsed under precise daytime strikes. The psychological blow was just as heavy. Civilians watched American fighters strafe airfields at noon, rake trains, and hit ships in Tokyo Bay. The idea of a divine wind guarding the homeland died when U.S. fighters flashed over the Imperial Palace itself. Lieutenant Colonel John R. Morgan of the 437th flew photo recon in a gunless, camera-equipped P-51D. His reports laid bare aviation's collapse. Airfield's intelligence listed as hundreds of aircraft held maybe a dozen flyable planes. The rest were hulks, no engines, no props, stripped for parts. Ground crews rolled wrecks around to fool photo interpreters, but experienced eyes knew a decoy from a runner. Some fields even set out dummy wooden aircraft complete with painted markings to draw fire from the few real machines hidden under netting. The industrial math told the story. The United States built 15,586 Mustangs of all marks, more than Japan's total aircraft output in 1944-45 combined. Japan produced about 3,500 Ka-84s. Many died on the ground under B-29s and carrier strikes, crashed in training due to poor quality control, or sat idle for lack of parts. North American aviation hit its stride as Japan's factories unraveled. At peak, Enoha-A turned out roughly 20 P-51s a day, more Ka-84s than Japan could build in a month. Each American airframe came off the line essentially identical, with parts that swapped cleanly, while Japanese fighters varied widely, even within a single batch. Training pipelines showed the same imbalance. By 1945, the U.S. was producing roughly 30,000 pilots a year, each receiving 200-300 hours before advanced fighter school and another 100 hours of combat prep. Japan's program had effectively broken down. New pilots sometimes arrived with 50 hours total, often less. Attrition's logic was merciless. The U.S. could replace losses without lowering standards. Japan could not replace them even after slashing requirements. For every Japanese pilot trained, America trained 10 and sent them forward better prepared. Fuel usage spelled out the endgame. A typical Iwo P-51 mission burned about 600 gallons of 100 octane per airplane, internal plus drop tanks. With 100 fighters on a day's sortie, that's roughly 60,000 gallons for one group. U.S. tankers delivered millions of gallons per month across the Pacific, an ocean of fuel-feeding airfields from Saipan to Iwo. Japan tried to make aviation fuel from pine stumps, about 200 stumps per gallon of marginal product, and converted trainers to kamikaze because there wasn't fuel for normal ops. By August 1945, less than 200,000 gallons remained in the home islands, perhaps enough for a single major effort. The P-51D also represented a way of war. Mass production, plus quality control, standardization across plants, and constant improvement from combat feedback. A pilot could strap into any D model and know exactly how it would handle and where every switch lived. Japanese airframes, increasingly hand-built from substitute materials, showed erratic performance. Even two Ka-84s from the same factory might differ dramatically, one capable of 400 knot MEMS, another struggling past 350 due to manufacturing drift. Brigadier General Ernest M. Moore, 7th Fighter Command, put it plainly: the P-51 was the best prop-driven fighter of the war, top escort, and the equal of the P-47 for ground attack. That judgment covered not just speed and range, but reliability, maintainability, and the ability to endure very long-range ops. A P-51 could refuel and rearm in about 30 minutes, fly 2 sorties a day if needed, and operate from rough coral strips that would chew up more delicate types. Maintenance numbers told the rest. On Iwo, P-51Ds held operational rates above 80% despite volcanic grit, salt air, and mostly outdoor servicing. Engine swaps took about 4 hours with mobile cranes and checklists. Battle damage that would sideline a Japanese fighter for weeks could be patched overnight with prefab parts flown in. The Ki-84, even with fuel and ammo, often saw serviceability under 40%, sometimes near 20%. The complex Homar needed special tools that units lacked, skilled technicians who were dead or drafted, and spare parts that had to be hand-fitted thanks to loose tolerances. Weather reconnaissance saved American lives by the dozen. Dedicated B-29 weather ships flew hours ahead, calling cloud decks, winds, and fronts. Those reports let planners root around the worst of it, though Black Friday proved weather could still ambush the best. Japanese units, lacking comparable support, sometimes flew blind into systems that shredded whole formations. Communications were just as advanced. High-frequency beacons from submarines and island stations. Submarine-led rescue control that could vector search planes to downed pilots. And real-time weather updates formed a safety net that emboldened crews to stretch range. The knowledge that someone will come looking mattered as much as a few extra gallons of gas. Japanese pilots often launched with radios that barely worked and no hope of rescue. Farewells before missions were literal. Captain Harry Krim Jr. of the 581st, an ace over Japan with 7 victories, summarized the strategic truth. We owned the sky. The Japanese knew, Americans knew, civilians knew. P-51s over Tokyo were proof the war was lost. The VLR campaign rewrote the Pacific equation. Distance, Japan's oldest shield, no longer protected the heartland. After 3 years of relative safety, industry at home faced daily attack. The sight of American fighters above the capital erased the last illusions, broke the divine wind myth, and made defeat feel inevitable. The costs, measured in people, reflected the technology gap. From July 4 to August 15, 1945, 85 American fighter pilots died on VLR missions. Only a few, perhaps 5 or 6, were lost in air combat. Most were operational, weather, mechanicals, navigation errors, exhaustion. Japanese pilot losses ran into the hundreds, perhaps past 1,000, with entire Sentai wiped out trying to intercept. The Fora Boeuf Sentai began April with 40 operational pilots. By August, 3 remained. The 244th was destroyed, reformed, and destroyed again. The final dogfights showed Japanese air power collapsing as an institution. On August 14, 1945, August 15th in Japan across the international date line, Lieutenant Jerry Yellen flew the war's last combat mission with 19-year-old wingman, Second Lieutenant Phil Schlamberg. They hit airfields near Nagoya. The mission was launched before news of surrender reached the line. The recall code Utah never reached their sets. They strafed and turned for home, diving into cloud to dodge flak. Yellen emerged. Schlamberg did not. Downed by ground fire, the last American combat death of World War II. Even with the Emperor's surrender already recorded, Japanese guns still shot in grim habit. Notably absent were fighters, out of fuel, out of pilots, or simply gone. The Air War's arithmetic was final, written in aluminum and blood. A P-51D, 440 mph on top, roughly 2,000 miles with tanks, 6 reliable .50s with nearly 2,000 rounds, left the home islands naked to daylight attack. The Ki-84, for all its paper strengths and its pilot's courage, never fielded the numbers, readiness, or training to mount a credible defense. This was never a duel of equals. The result was fixed as much by Detroit's factories and Texas oil as by any turn above Tokyo. American industrial power expressed in the Mustang did what blockade and island hopping could not. It erased Japan's air defense. The B-29s that dropped atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew unescorted not for lack of fighters, but because none were required. Opposition had been swept aside by superior technology, training, and production. Of 3,514 Ki-84s built, only one survives at the Chiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima, a lone relic of a desperate bid to match American advances. Hundreds of P-51s, meanwhile, still exist in museums and private hands. Many fly at air shows. Merlin engines singing 7 decades after those first Tokyo missions. That survival gap speaks volumes. American aircraft were built to endure, maintained meticulously, and preserved as history. Japanese machines were built for immediate war, expected to be spent. The shock Japanese pilots felt at seeing Mustangs over Tokyo was more than tactics. It was the realization that American industry and science had made the impossible routine. Single-engine fighters flying 1,500-mile combat legs, arriving with fuel to fight for 2 hours, then coming home. The P-51D over Mount Fuji was more than a shape in the sky. It was the emblem of industrial supremacy, technical innovation, and the hard math of total war. The lesson was stark. In modern conflict, superior technology multiplied by massive production equals victory. The Mustang marked American industry at full power. Over 15,000 built to consistent standards, flown by well-trained crews, backed by limitless logistics, and used with strategic precision. Against that, Japan's Ki-84, despite bravery and the occasional success, had no chance. The shock of U.S. fighters over Tokyo was, in the end, the shock of arithmetic. That story closed with atomic fire delivered by B-29s that needed no escort because Japanese air power no longer existed. The Mustangs had proved distance is not a shield. That industry outweighs warrior spirit, and that applied technical superiority is decisive. Japanese pilots learned the hardest modern lesson. Courage alone can't beat the math of production, technology, and logistics. The P-51D over Tokyo marked the end of the samurai age and the rise of the production line, the supercharger, and the very long-range escort. The divine wind yielded to science. The warrior's will broke against industry. The rising sun fell under wings of aluminum and engines of steel.